At 40 she had lost all hope of love. The Duke changed her life before the night ended. November had come to London like a creditor who knew every door in town. It tapped at panes with wet fingers, leaned its grey face against the windows of Harrow House, and made the lamps along the square burn as if they were defending themselves. Inside, music glittered and failed and glittered again. Outside, the rain insisted. It had the patience of disappointment, and Elinor Harrow, standing just beyond the blaze of the ballroom, understood that kind of patience very well. At 40, she had become the sort of woman people learned not to look at directly. Not because she was plain. She was not plain. Her face was fine-boned, her gaze clear, her mouth thoughtful rather than small. But youth had ceased to announce her, and society seldom bothered to search for quieter forms of beauty once the loudest kind had left the room. Her younger cousins were introduced. Her sister's girls were admired. Her stepbrother's guests were courted, flattered, measured, and remembered. Elinor, in her dove-gray gown with its modest neckline and long sleeves, was trusted with the keys, the shawls, the seating of the timid, the rescue of embarrassed servants, the smoothing over of any small human disarray that wealth liked to pretend did not exist. She stood beside a marble pillar near the conservatory doors because that was where forgotten things naturally collected. Cloaks misplaced in haste, old ladies briefly abandoned by their companions, young girls too shy to cross the room, and one little footman not long out of childhood who had dropped a tray and looked as if he expected the earth to open beneath him. Elinor relieved him of that expectation by taking the broken glasses from his shaking hands and telling him, very quietly, to fetch more. She said it so matter-of-factly that he obeyed instead of apologizing. That, too, had become one of her hidden skills. She knew how to make catastrophe feel temporary. Across the room, laughter rose around her half-sister Lydia, who wore sea-green silk and the triumph of being noticed. Lydia had always been younger than the hour required, prettier than the task in front of her, and better at receiving admiration than Elinor had ever been at requesting ordinary kindness. When she caught Elinor's eye, she lifted one jeweled hand in the universal household signal that meant deal with this. The this in question was Mrs. Quenby, a widow with a weak ankle who needed escorting to a chair nearer the fire. Elinor crossed to her at once. Such motions had made up the better part of her adult life. Her father had died when she was 26. Her mother's small dowry had vanished into the maintenance of Harrow House, then into Edmund Harrow's clever investments, then into explanations. Explanations had multiplied as coin diminished. Elinor's name, once attached to a modest settlement, became attached instead to usefulness. She kept accounts. She wrote letters. She soothed offended tradesmen, found tutors, arranged menus, and remembered which tenants on the Hampshire property had sons at sea. She did these things so well that everyone around her forgot they were labor. They called it devotion. They called it natural goodness. They called it a blessing to have her. No one called it a life. No one except herself late at night, when honesty came easier in the dark. She had not always been without hope. Years ago there had been a curate who spoke to her as if her sentences mattered. There had been a winter during which she had foolishly imagined that the vicar's scholarly brother admired her mind. There had been 2 offers, both practical, both from men who needed a nurse more than a wife. She had refused them then with gratitude and relief. She had not been in love with those men. She had merely been afraid of a future in which love would never be offered at all. Time had not mocked that fear. It had educated it. A fresh piece of music began. The first violin took the melody as if it meant to dazzle the room into obedience. Elinor guided Mrs. Quenby to the fire and then, because there was no place left for her in the glow, slipped into the conservatory where the air was cooler and smelled faintly of wet earth. The glass panes above her were silvered with rain. Lemon trees stood in painted tubs like dowagers refusing exile. At the far end of the room, beside an iron stand of potted roses gone nearly bare for winter, a white bloom still held stubbornly to a thorned branch. Late snow. Read the tiny painted label below it. She bent to straighten the label, which had tilted sideways in the soil. One last blossom, she thought. One last insistence. There was something so unreasonable in the flower's persistence that it made her smile before she could stop herself. She touched one petal with the back of her finger. "Late things are not always lost things," she murmured. "No," said a man's voice from the doorway, low and unhurried. "Sometimes they arrive at precisely the hour that reveals everyone else too soon." Elinor turned. The gentleman standing there was not dressed for theatrical effect. His coat was excellent cloth cut with restraint rather than vanity. His linen was plain, his gloves dark with rain, his hair damp at the temples as if he had come through the weather rather than around it. There was nothing in him of the jeweled suitor. And yet the room altered around him in the quiet way a room alters around a fire once it has fully taken hold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and still. Men who were accustomed to being observed often moved too much inside that knowledge. This man did not. His stillness seemed less like self-consciousness and more like command held in reserve. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to startle you." "You did not startle me," Elinor answered, though he had. His mouth almost smiled. "Then I stand corrected. Mr. Vale. A late arrival and, I suspect, an inadequate dancer." She knew the name. Lady Agatha Vale, a distant connection of the Harrows, had been expected this evening. But no Duke or Viscount had been announced at dinner. No illustrious widower laid at Lydia's feet. Mr. Vale was therefore either a relation of modest consequence or a man clever enough not to parade greater consequence before strangers. "Miss Harrow," she said. His gaze rested on her for one moment longer than custom required. Not rudely, not hungrily, merely fully. The sensation was so unfamiliar that she felt it like heat. From the ballroom came Lydia's laugh again, clear as glass struck with a spoon. Somewhere behind it Elinor could hear Edmund boasting about an upcoming lease, and about economies he had made, and about the blessing of having a sister who managed inconveniences before they could become expenses. The word expenses came to her as distinctly as if the rain had whispered it into the conservatory. Mr. Vale heard it too. His head turned almost imperceptibly. "Your brother sounds proud," he said. "He is my stepbrother, and pride is one of his more sustainable habits." That earned her the smile she had suspected. It transformed him without softening him. He looked, she thought absurdly, like a man who had forgotten how to be amused until something true passed before him. From inside came Edmund's voice again. "Wasted on management are Elinor. Keeps a ledger like a clerk and a household like a regimental quartermaster. But I dare say no gentleman in London is eager to marry 40 years of duty in a grey dress. Norfolk will be solution enough." The gentleman near him laughed. Lydia made a tiny noise of protest too delicate to count as one. Elinor went still. She had known, in the practical way one knows the direction of winter, that Edmund intended some arrangement. A cousin's rectory. A widower's nursery. A provincial invalid. Not London. Not choice. But hearing it priced in public, and hearing her age used like an invoice, caused something colder than shame to pass through her. She felt nothing. It was a lie. Mr. Vale said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Norfolk? Apparently so. Against your wishes?" She looked at him. "Do my wishes appear to govern much in this house?" The rain pressed harder on the panes. The white rose trembled but did not break. Something in the man's expression changed then, not into pity but into decision. She did not know yet that she was watching the instant her life shifted on its unseen hinge. She only knew that when Mr. Vale asked, a few minutes later, if she would walk with him to the library because he had a matter of urgency to place before her, the night had already begun to behave like fate. The library at Harrow House was handsome in the way of rooms paid for by previous generations and dusted by the women of the present one. Dark shelves climbed toward a plaster ceiling painted with clouds that had never known rain. The fire was low. The candles threw patient circles upon the carpet. When Elinor entered, Mr. Vale closed the door with careful politeness and then stood opposite her, one hand resting on the back of a chair as if he had no intention of using it. "Before I speak," he said, "you should know that I have not brought you here for flirtation. I have brought you here because I am in need of honesty, and because I suspect you have had very little of it offered to you tonight." It was not how men spoke to her. Not men who had met her within the last quarter hour. They usually offered bland admiration for her calm, or respectful gratitude for some household efficiency they wished their own sisters possessed. This man sounded as if truth were a practical object he intended to set between them on the table. "Honesty is rarely improved by an introduction," she said. "Then let me begin without one. I am not merely Mr. Vale. My full name is Sebastian Vale, and I am the Duke of Westerleigh." She stared at him. There are discoveries that enter the mind like thunder and discoveries that enter like a key turning in a distant lock. This was the second kind. It rearranged the room first, and only afterwards struck the heart. The plainness of his coat ceased to be modesty and became strategy. The stillness she had noticed became rank-wearing silence. The absence of jewels became a privilege so secure it had no need of ornaments. She inclined her head because she could think of nothing else to do. "Your Grace, for the next few minutes, if you can bear it, I would rather remain the man you met beside the rose." "And what man is that?" "A desperate one." He did not dramatize the word. He stated it. That made it more arresting. He explained with the speed of someone accustomed to being concise when stakes were high. His father, distrustful of younger sons and cousins but devoted to the tenant widows supported by the Westerleigh Benevolence Trust, had built a legal snare into the ducal settlements. If Sebastian reached his 42nd birthday without a duchess installed and acknowledged as co-governor of the trust's domestic charities, temporary control of the fund and several associated cottages would pass for 3 years to his cousin Benedict Vale, who had already made no secret of wishing to consolidate land, dismiss pensioners, and turn cottages into profitable hunting lodges. Sebastian's birthday was tomorrow. The trustees would meet at noon. The Duchess did not need to be in love. She needed to exist. Elinor listened in stillness, but not the stillness of calm. The story was too outlandish for invention and too dry in its details to be romantic nonsense. He named the attorneys involved, the clauses, the date on which the codicil had been signed, the exact number of widow cottages presently protected, and the peculiar stipulation that the Duchess must not be a minor, must sign in her own right, and must take visible residence at Ashcombe Hall. Such useless specificity had the weight of truth. "And you thought of me," she said at last. "I did, because I am available, because you are competent, because you are self-possessed, because you are not in pursuit of my title, because in the quarter hour since I met you, I saw you rescue a servant from humiliation, comfort a guest no one else wished to sit with, correct a rose label no one else noticed, and hear cruelty without allowing it to make you cruel in return. Because your stepbrother has just announced to half his card room that you keep accounts better than any steward he has hired. Because I require a wife who can govern a household and a trust with steadiness. And because I find I would rather ask a truthful woman than bargain with an ambitious one." She did not know what to do with the force of such seeing. It was not tenderness. Not yet. It was recognition which felt in that moment even more dangerous. "You are asking me to marry you tonight. I am." He drew breath. "I am also asking you to understand that I am not offering a courtship disguised as charity. I will settle £30,000 upon you immediately. Your separate income will be protected. Any debts or claims your stepbrother attempts to press upon your name will be extinguished by my solicitors. You will have authority over Ashcombe Hall, over the household accounts, and over the Benevolence Trust's domestic disbursements. I will never demand that you feign a girlish happiness you do not feel. I ask for legality, residence, respectability, and partnership. Nothing more than you can freely give. Nothing more." The phrase should have made the matter cold. Instead it made it honest. "And if I refuse? Then I will ride before dawn to a woman I do not esteem and place my mother's cottages in the hands of Providence." He paused. "Or Benedict, which is another word for ruin." Elinor gave a short breath that was almost laughter and almost disbelief. "You offer matrimony as if it were a rescue and an audit in one package. Is that offensive?" "No, merely original." He watched her with that grave attention of his. She understood suddenly that he was a man who had spent years being wanted for the wrong reasons and had come to value plain speech the way other men valued flattery. That did not make him safe, but it made him legible. "There is one thing I must know," she said. "Why did you not ask Lady Arabella Winford? Half London expected you to." A faint line appeared beside his mouth. Because Lady Arabella wants a stage and I require a steward. Because she admires Westerleigh. I need someone who might care for Ashcombe. And because I have no wish to be praised at breakfast by a woman who cannot tell whether a tenant is hungry unless hunger has become tedious to her. The judgment was sharp enough to suggest history. You speak harshly of a lady. I speak accurately of a woman who would be harsh in return if my circumstances did not inconvenience hers. Elinor crossed to the hearth. Heat touched her face. Beyond the library door she could still hear the house performing pleasure. She imagined Norfolk. She imagined the rest of her life reduced to someone else's remedy. She imagined Ashcombe Hall, unknown and distant and cold, but hers in some legal sense if not in a romantic one. A duchess at 40. The notion felt absurd. Yet so did being sold piecemeal to whatever future her stepbrother found economically graceful. "Would you permit one condition?" she asked. "If it is within my power. That the village women supported by the trust will not become decorations in a report. If I go with you, I would rather be useful where usefulness is not merely a prettier word for disposal." Something moved behind his eyes then. Surprise, perhaps, or approval too swift to hide. "Agreed," he said. "And another. Name it. Do not lie to me once I have entered your house. Withhold what you must for a legal hour if you must. But do not make a fool of me in my own marriage." He held her gaze. "I will not." She believed him enough to be frightened by the belief. The rest happened with the terrible efficiency of irrevocable decisions. Lady Agatha Vale was summoned. She arrived not fluttering but alert, took in Elinor with one penetrating look, and said only, "At last, Sebastian has remembered that admiration is not the same thing as trust." A carriage was called quietly. A special license, already procured in case Providence favored urgency, waited with the Duke's secretary. Edmund Harrow was informed only when he could no longer interfere without publicly offending a peer whose displeasure he could not afford. Edmund burst into the library purple with outrage. He spoke of impropriety, misunderstanding, haste, and family honor. Sebastian listened until the words family honor escaped him, and then said in a voice so level it chilled the room, "Mr. Harrow, a man who auctions his sister's future in a card room should avoid the language of honor unless he means to pay for it in cash." Elinor had never seen Edmund silenced by anything other than bankruptcy. It was almost enough to steady her. Lydia wept because history was happening to someone else. The vicar was fetched. Rain still drummed at the windows as if the whole city were being reminded that weather did not stop for astonishment. A little after midnight, in the Harrows' private chapel with only 6 witnesses and the scent of extinguished candles in the air, Elinor Harrow became her grace, the Duchess of Westerleigh. The vows did not tremble in Sebastian's mouth. Neither did they in hers. Their hands met, cool and certain. If romance existed in the chapel, it did not arrive as sweetness. It arrived as a profound and unsettling sense that 2 solitary forms of endurance had recognized each other. Before the night ended, the Duke had changed her life. She did not yet know whether he had saved it. Dawn found the world scrubbed of spectacle. London after rain looked less like a capital and more like a confession. Elinor sat opposite her new husband in the Duke's traveling carriage while the city slowly fell away behind them. The marriage lines were folded in a leather case at Sebastian's side. His gloved hand rested atop it as if guarding evidence. He had offered her sleep, blankets, brandy, silence, and conversation in that order. She had taken the blanket and the silence, though not entirely. Silence between strangers could be merciful. Silence between husband and wife felt like the outline of a question. "You should rest," he said when he noticed her looking out at the paling hedgerows. "If I sleep, I may wake believing I invented all this. Then I will take that as evidence you remain sensible." The answer was dry enough to invite a smile, and when she did smile, however faintly, he seemed to relax by one invisible degree. Ashcombe Hall rose out of the morning mist 2 hours later, all pale stone and long windows and measured authority. It did not lunge into view like a palace. It assembled itself from the landscape, as if the hill had decided to become a house. Lawns rolled down toward a copse of bare trees. Beyond them lay tenant cottages, low and smoke-breathing. The stables spread wide to the east. Gardens, formal even in winter, held their geometry against the season. The place was beautiful in the stern manner of things built to outlast affection. Servants lined the entrance hall when they arrived. Their bows were correct. Their curiosity was not entirely hidden. A housekeeper with a face like folded linen introduced herself as Mrs. Flint. A butler shaped by decades of discretion introduced himself as Pritchard. No one said the word sudden, but it hung in the marble air between every greeting. Sebastian did not present Elinor like an apology. That mattered more than she expected. "This is my wife," he said. "Her Grace will take charge of the domestic household at once. Any questions of routine, accounts, stores, menus, sewing, schoolroom charities, and winter distributions will be referred to her before they are referred to me." There it was. Authority, not ornament. She was shown to rooms that had belonged to the previous Duchess, Sebastian's mother. They were elegant without being intimate. Lavender had been laid in the drawers. A fire already burned. On the dressing table stood a small arrangement of winter greenery and, at its center, a single white rosebud cut from a forcing house. Elinor touched it and wondered who had thought to place it there. She suspected Lady Agatha. She was wrong. The first days at Ashcombe were not cruel. Cruelty requires a personal effort, and no one in the house knew her well enough yet to commit one. What they offered instead was formal deference, which could be lonelier than dislike. She and Sebastian breakfasted separately because a mountain of post awaited him every morning. They dined at opposite ends of a long mahogany table capable of seating 20. When they spoke, it was often about arrangements. Mrs. Flint required new inventories before Christmas. A dairy wall had cracked. Pritchard wished to know whether the Duchess preferred the blue drawing room or the morning room for callers. The tenants of the South cottages had requested additional coal allowances. The trusts would need signatures. Useful things. Necessary things. None of them warmed the silence after dusk. Sebastian was never inattentive. That was its own peculiar difficulty. He noticed if her tea cooled untouched. He noticed if the wind made the gallery lamps flicker and had the casements checked before supper. He noticed that she avoided the portrait of the late Duke in the West Corridor and altered their route without comment. But he remained controlled, almost ceremonially so, as if kindness were safest when measured. One evening, 3 days into the marriage, Elinor found him alone in the trustee's room with a sheaf of settlement papers laid open before him. Candlelight cut hollows under his eyes. "You have been awake since dawn," she said from the doorway. "So, I believe, have you?" That was not an answer. He looked at her then, properly looked, and something in his expression made him seem suddenly less like a duke and more like a man who had carried responsibility long enough for it to become a second skeleton. "The trustees accepted the marriage," he said. "Benedict did not obtain the interim control he wanted. The cottages remain protected. Then that part of the bargain is secure." "Yes. And the rest?" A quieter answer would have been easier. He did not choose it. "The rest is more difficult because I do not wish you to feel purchased." She entered the room. "I do not feel purchased. I feel transferred. The distinction is not romantic, but it is important." For an instant, to her astonishment, he laughed. A real laugh, brief and disbelieving. "God help me, Duchess. I may have married the only woman in England who can improve my mood by refining the vocabulary of discomfort. Then we are both fortunate." Yet fortune did not immediately become ease. She learned the rooms, the rhythms, the temper of the kitchens, the strengths and grievances of the upper servants. Ashcombe Hall had been well managed in the broad sense and neglected in the intimate one. Stores were overbought in sugar and underbought in lamp oil. Linen closets were immaculate while the nursery wing, no longer used, leaked cold into the adjoining corridor. The accounts for charitable disbursements were accurate in totals and careless in names, a sloppiness Elinor disliked because anonymity was often the first insult paid to need. She began where she always began, with attention, domestic_1. Within a week, Mrs. Flint started bringing small problems to her before breakfast rather than after luncheon. Within 2 weeks, Pritchard ceased announcing every detail as if the Duchess might faint at the mention of butcher's bills. The maid straightened when Elinor entered, not from fear, but because she remembered who had a sick mother and who preferred to scrub silver in silence. The cook discovered that the new duchess could tell the difference between thrift and meanness. The seamstress learned that gray need not mean despair. There are households that change by command and households that change because one person begins to see them properly. Ashcombe, to its own surprise, proved to be the second kind. Sebastian saw the alteration too. Not all at once. In evidence. A disputed invoice quietly resolved. Winter curtains rehung before the first hard frost. 2 elderly tenants receiving broth and coal without needing to beg for either. The stable accounts balanced down to 6pence. The footmen less afraid of error. The kitchens calmer. The house itself, vast as it was, seemed to exhale. Yet between the Duke and Duchess there remained a corridor neither had crossed. It was lit. It was civil. It was very long. The thaw began so quietly that Elinor could not have named the morning on which it started if later memory had not forced her to. It was not the morning he thanked her for finding fraud in the London wine invoice. It was not the afternoon he asked, without irony, what proportion of the winter beef should be salted and what proportion sold before spoilage. It was not even the evening he sent down from his study a note requesting that the old women in the East cottages receive wool before the next rain, because her grace informs me they feel cold before they complain, which is a useful distinction. The change began with tea. She had been in the still room late one windy afternoon reviewing kitchen orders when Mrs. Flint mentioned, in the tone of a loyal servant betraying a master for his own good, that his grace had once again neglected luncheon and would likely go on neglecting supper unless reminded that men were mortal. Elinor hesitated only long enough to ask whether such reminders were usually welcomed. Welcomed? Mrs. Flint said. No. Effective? Sometimes. More effective from you, perhaps. So Elinor carried a tray herself to the Duke's study, telling herself the action was practical and therefore safe. Sebastian looked up from estate maps with the expression of a man returning from a much harsher climate. Mrs. Flint has enlisted you against me, he said. Mrs. Flint believes all people should be prevented from mistaking fatigue for virtue. A dangerous philosophy in this house. Then let us begin reform with a teapot. He sat back. It was a small thing, that moment, and yet it altered their arrangement more than any settlement paper had done. He poured for her before he poured for himself. She noticed that his right hand tightened slightly when he reached for the cup. He noticed that she took no sugar. They discussed the maps spread before him. Drainage near the lower meadow, repairs needed to the tenant roofs, the legal absurdity of a boundary stone disputed for 30 years because 2 dead men had each been too proud to lose 6 feet of mud. He was drier in private than he allowed himself to be in company. She was sharper. They began, little by little, to surprise each other into ease. Domestic_2. A week later she found in the morning room a volume of Cooper she had once mentioned enjoying. It had not appeared by accident. No note accompanied it. No servant claimed responsibility. Sebastian, when she thanked him at dinner, merely said, the library had become too educational. That was all. But his gaze remained on her a moment longer, and she understood the gift for what it was. Not sentiment, but attention turned tangible. He began to ask her opinion before acting. Never ceremonially. Never with the pomp of a husband graciously consulting a wife. He asked because he had learned that her answers improved the day. Should the steward dismiss Farmer Leake's excuse as drunkenness or investigate the drainage failure first? Investigate. The man drank more after the field failed, not before. Should the old nursery suite be closed entirely for winter? No, the sun there was best. Let the seamstresses use it during daylight and save lamp oil elsewhere. Was the blue silk Lady Agatha had sent $2,000 for the Christmas musicale at Ashcombe? Not if worn without diamonds. She answered, and Ashcombe shifted around the answers. When Lady Agatha finally arrived in residence a fortnight before Christmas, she did so like a dowager ship entering harbor under full authority. Her maid, her spaniel, her lap desk, and her opinions all reached the front steps at once. Elinor braced herself for inspection. Instead, the older woman embraced her lightly and said, "My dear, you have already done the difficult part. You have made this house feel inhabited by the living again. Sebastian, standing behind them, looked almost boyish for one stunned instant. I had hoped for something less sentimental from you, Aunt, and I had hoped for a nephew who would marry before middle age, Lady Agatha replied. Since neither of us has been perfectly answered, we must accept mercy where it appears. Mercy appeared in stranger forms after that. It appeared in the Duke lingering by the drawing-room fire after dinner instead of retreating at once to his papers. It appeared in Lady Agatha telling outrageous stories of Sebastian as a solemn child who once attempted to regulate a village pageant with a notebook. It appeared in Elinor laughing openly and then stopping, startled by the sound of her own laughter in that room. It appeared in Sebastian looking at that laughter as if it were something astonishingly rare. The household intimacy came on the first truly bitter evening of the season. Frost webbed the lower panes. The formal dining room, despite its candles and polish, felt like a beautiful threat. Elinor sat at one far end of the enormous table while Sebastian sat at the other, and between them stretched enough polished mahogany to accommodate a family, an argument, and a generation of silence. Pritchard had just removed the soup when Sebastian set down his spoon. "This is absurd," he said. Elinor glanced up. The soup? The geography? He looked the length of the table as if it had personally offended him. Then, to the butler's frozen astonishment, he said, "Tomorrow have this monstrous thing covered and moved to the long gallery. Put a round table in the library. Not large. For chairs at most. We dine there henceforth unless ceremony absolutely compels this room." Pritchard blinked. "Very good, Your Grace." Sebastian turned back to Elinor. "If I must ask my wife to pass the salt, I refuse to do it by shouting." Something warm and dangerous moved through her. Not because he had called her wife. He had used the word before. But because this was the first time he had changed the physical world to reduce the distance between them. The next evening the library held a round walnut table near the fire. On it stood a low bowl with winter greenery and, at the center, one white rose from the forcing house. Elinor touched the rim of her plate and knew, with the almost painful clarity of delayed happiness, that intimacy did not always arrive in declarations. Sometimes it arrived as furniture moved 6 yards closer to warmth. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." After dinner they remained where they were instead of retreating at once into separate usefulness. Lady Agatha pretended not to notice. The fire loosened the room. Sebastian asked Elinor whether she had always liked roses. She answered him with more honesty than she intended. "Only the late ones," she said. "They seem less vain." His eyes met hers across the candlelight. "Or more courageous," he said. Courage, Elinor discovered, could feel remarkably like routine once repeated enough times. She went on being useful because usefulness was the grammar she knew best. The surprise lay in discovering that usefulness in a beloved place did not diminish a woman. It enlarged her. Lady Agatha, whose affection had all the stealth of a military campaign, took to inviting Elinor for half an hour each morning under the pretense of requiring assistance with correspondence. In reality she required news. Which maid had become quietly engaged? Which tenant widow was too proud to ask for boots? Which account book had once again misplaced reason under columns of numbers? Agatha listened, probed, and occasionally said something that landed with the precision of a pin in silk. "My dear," she remarked one morning while warming her hands over the brazier, "men who have been admired for years often mistake admiration for intimacy. It takes them far too long to learn that being looked at is not the same thing as being known. Sebastian is late in many things, but not, I think, in learning." Elinor lowered her eyes to the letter she was sealing. "He has been nothing but honorable." "Yes," Agatha said. "That is not the same as harmless." The older woman smiled when Elinor colored. It was intolerable and kind. Domestic_3. Near Christmas, Sebastian asked whether she would ride out with him to the East Cottages. The day was iron gray. The roads held the memory of rain. She wore a smoke-blue pelisse, high at the throat and close at the wrists, lined in wool. He helped her into the curricle with bare-headed concentration, his gloved hand steady at her elbow. The touch lasted no longer than propriety required. It lasted longer than her pulse approved. The cottages were smaller than the charity reports had made them sound. One widow kept 2 grandchildren and a cough. Another refused assistance until Elinor complimented the order of her shelves, whereupon gratitude emerged disguised as criticism of the coal. Sebastian watched Elinor move through those narrow rooms with grave ease, seeing what needed seeing without turning pity into theater. On the ride home he said, "My mother used to notice when people had polished their shoes for visitors even if the soles were split. She said it was a kind of dignity no gentleman should insult by pretending not to observe." Elinor turned toward him. He spoke of his mother rarely. "You resemble her in that," he added. The compliment struck too deep to answer quickly. "I did not know her." Few did properly. She was easier to admire than to deserve. He guided the horse through a rutted bend. "When she died, this house remained efficient. It did not remain warm. I have sometimes thought it blamed me for surviving her." The confession was quiet enough that she understood it had cost him something. She answered with equal care. "Houses blame the living for all sorts of things, mostly because the dead are beyond correction." He glanced at her then, and the winter light, for one impossible instant, seemed to soften around them. When snow finally came, it arrived in a disciplined white hush and made Ashcombe look less stern, as if the whole estate had been offered a second draft. Elinor found herself walking to the forcing house almost every afternoon. The gardener had done his best with the roses, but the white variety, late snow, required patience, pruning, and the refusal to mistake delay for failure. She gave it all 3. One evening Sebastian followed her there. She knew he was present before she heard him because the air altered. He carried no lantern. The glass roof held the last blue of dusk. Bare canes and winter pots made pale shadows around them. "Mrs. Flint tells me the Duchess steals greenhouse time from the rest of her duties," he said. "Mrs. Flint is a dangerous source. She is usually accurate." Elinor smiled and touched the soil at the base of the rose. It was neglected, not dead. "Those are not the same state." "No," he said. He was not speaking of the flower anymore. She felt it at once. He stepped nearer, stopping while there was still room for refusal between them. Candlelight from the distant corridor reached only part of his face. The rest belonged to dusk. "I owe you another honesty," he said. The warmth she had begun to trust in that small glass house withdrew a little, not from him, but from her own caution. "Then give it. When I first asked you to marry me, I told you I chose you because I needed a capable duchess before the trustees met. That was true. It was not the whole truth. I had seen you once before tonight." Her breath caught. He continued before she could speak. Weeks earlier, he had visited Harrow House unofficially with Lady Agatha to assess a possible Christmas subscription fund. He had remained in the vestibule during a reception long enough to watch Elinor settle 2 squabbling tenants over holiday stipends while Edmund took public credit for generosity he had not funded. Sebastian had asked who she was. Agatha had answered with a line that had stayed with him. "The only necessary person in that house, and the least thanked." "I remembered you," he said. "When I saw you beside the rose, I knew at once who you were. I should have told you that night." "Why did you not?" "Because urgency is a cowardly chaperone to truth. And because if I admitted I had chosen you twice, the proposal might have begun to sound less like contract and more like desire. I was not certain you would forgive desire from a stranger." She looked at him in the blue hush among the winter plants. "And now? Now I am less afraid of honesty than of silence." The forcing house seemed suddenly too small for her heartbeat. Yet he did not touch her. He let the moment rest where it had been placed, as if he would rather endure uncertainty than take what she had not yet offered. That restraint undid her more than impatience might have done. "You were right the first night," she said softly. "Late things are not always lost things, but they are often difficult to trust." "Then I will be patient," he answered, "even if patience proves expensive." She laughed, and his mouth curved in answer, and the room, bare branches, damp earth, winter glass, became in her memory the first place in Ashcombe that felt less like residence and more like beginning. January brought London to Ashcombe in the form of invitations, obligations, and Lady Arabella Winford. Even before she arrived, her presence announced itself by indirection. Cards edged in black and silver, notes written in a hand too elegant to be innocent, inquiries about whether the new Duchess preferred music or cards, whether she danced, whether she played, whether she was ill, shy, severe, rustic, pious, clever, or merely older than rumor would comfortably allow. Society never asks a question when it can ask 12 and arrange them to resemble kindness. Lady Arabella called on a pearl-colored afternoon with a pair of bay horses, an exquisite pelisse, and condolences so polished they might have served at a funeral or a wedding with equal efficiency. She was beautiful, as everyone said. Dark curls, luminous skin, a mouth trained to appear generous even when withholding it. Her gown was a deep crimson, entirely proper in cut and coverage, yet calculated to remind any room that modesty need not prevent performance. "How delighted we all are," she said, taking Elinor's hands as if inspecting fine china. "Though surprised, naturally. Your grace moves with admirable speed. It is almost heroic in a quiet woman." Elinor answered with a composure that had cost her years to perfect. "I have found that quiet women are often required to move quickly, Lady Arabella. No one thinks to clear a path for them." Lady Arabella smiled. Her eyes did not. Sebastian entered halfway through the visit. The atmosphere changed by increments so fine a careless observer might have missed them. Arabella's voice warmed. Sebastian's cooled. Lady Agatha, who had stationed herself by the fire with a lap blanket and the expression of a retired general, became almost visibly entertained. By the end of the call, Elinor had learned several useful things. Lady Arabella had indeed expected, if not an offer, then at least a progression toward one. She had debts beautifully concealed within fashionable widowhood. She possessed a nephew whose prospects would improve considerably if Benedict Vale gained influence over Westerleigh lands. And she considered Elinor an insult not because Elinor had done anything cruel, but because she had quietly occupied a place Arabella had already furnished in her own imagination. Explainable, Elinor thought later. Entirely explainable. Not excusable. Domestic_4. The winter social obligations intensified. There was a musicale at Ashcombe, then a charity assembly in town, then Lady Belper's card evening, then a dinner at which half the county wished to discover whether the Duchess of Westerleigh was a saint, a fool, or an accident. Elinor survived them by declining to become either spectacle or apology. She wore colors of quiet assurance. Slate blue, dusk violet, soft silver. Never the bright colors that competed for notice. Never the dowdy fabrics Arabella seemed disappointed not to see. Sebastian noticed those choices. He also noticed the cost of each evening. On the drive home from Lady Belper's, after Arabella had remarked before 6 people that it was refreshing to see maturity carried with such humility, Sebastian snapped the carriage curtain with more force than necessary. If Lady Winford were any more charitable, he said, she would require a subscription list. Elinor looked at him in surprise, then amusement. "Please do not duel on my account. Society would be unbearable if deprived of you and left only with her. Society is already unbearable." "Not entirely," she said, and after a pause added, "I am in it with you." He turned toward her. The carriage lamp threw a moving gold across his face. For a breath, neither of them spoke. Her words had been lightly said. Their truth arrived with weight. At the next ball he asked her to dance. He had danced with her before, briefly, at their wedding breakfast when Lady Agatha forced the matter in the drawing-room and the servants pretended not to watch. This was different. This was public. The orchestra drew them into a measured turn beneath chandeliers while conversation along the walls thinned, then tilted, then resumed in altered key. Sebastian's hand rested at her back with meticulous restraint. Elinor's gloved fingers lay against his shoulder. Around them color flashed, jewels burned, laughter rose and fell. Yet the room seemed less important than the simple fact that he was looking only at her. "You need not rescue me from observation," she murmured. "I am not rescuing you. I am making poor strategic decisions for entirely selfish reasons. Those are new for you, so it would seem." His honesty had become sharper, not less. It no longer sounded like a man reporting terms. It sounded like a man running out of defenses. That same night, the first real blow landed. A whisper reached Lady Quenby that the Duchess had come to marriage with hidden debts. By supper, it had become hidden debts and hidden expectations. By breakfast, it had become that Elinor had cleverly managed an introduction to the Duke while arranging to be sent away from her family's house. By the next evening, someone suggested she had been in the library with him quite alone before the proposal, as if the library had not been full of law and witnesses within the hour. A rival's cruelty, Elinor thought, seldom arrives in claws. It begins in silk. Sebastian moved to stamp out the talk. Elinor asked him not to challenge shadows. They will only say I hide behind your title, she warned. You do hide behind my title in one sense, he said grimly. That is the entire point of titles when correctly employed. Still, he obeyed her, or seemed to. What he did instead was quieter. Invitations to Arabella's dinners were declined. Benedict Vale's letters went unanswered. An elderly judge with daughters was seated beside Arabella at a county supper and bored her magnificently. Lady Agatha, when particularly provoked, became a rumor of her own and spread truths with devastating courtesy. Yet the attacks did not cease. They refined themselves. By February the pattern was plain. Lady Arabella never struck in the same place twice. One week she implied that Elinor was uncomfortable in large houses because she had not been raised to them. The next she praised the Duchess's management so lavishly that it sounded like testimony better suited to a housekeeper. Then she allowed, in confidence, that the Duke had always admired practical women in theory, but that men of rank were often seized by brief moral enthusiasms. No statement was catastrophic. Taken together they formed an accusation. That Elinor had been selected for function and endured only from principle. It should not have hurt as much as it did. After all, part of it had once been true. That was the cruelty of half-truths. They borrow entrance from facts and then poison everything they touch. Domestic_5. One snow-bright morning Elinor found Sebastian in the library examining a jewel case left open upon the desk. Inside lay his mother's diamonds, severe and splendid. He looked as if he had discovered a weapon unsuited to his hand. Lady Agatha says I ought to ask whether you wish to wear these to the Founders' Ball in March, he said. Elinor came nearer. The diamonds were flawless. They were also not hers. Do you wish me to? He considered. I wish you to wear nothing that feels like costume. She touched the closed lid rather than the stones. Then no, perhaps pearls. Or nothing beyond what is necessary. Good, he said, with too much feeling for the subject to be merely sartorial. I had hoped you would say so. She looked up at him. You dislike display. I dislike false display. True magnificence never announces itself in panic. His gaze dropped briefly to the smoke-blue silk she held in her other hand. You understand that better than most people I know. The Founders' Ball would mark the public renewal of the Westerleigh Benevolence Trust, the signing of several estate contracts, and the attendance of nearly everyone who mattered in county society. It would also, Lady Agatha observed dryly, provide Lady Arabella a final theater in which to determine whether she preferred defeat to dignity. Elinor spent the weeks before it in work rather than anxiety. She revised disbursement records, checked dowry school subscriptions, confirmed accounts with the apothecary, and rode twice weekly with Sebastian to inspect roof repairs. Their partnership, once contractual, had grown unexpectedly instinctive. He asked where her gloves were when she forgot them. She reminded him which tenant's daughter had a wedding in Lent. He left newspapers folded open to articles he thought would amuse her. She began keeping the study fire laid before he arrived on stormy afternoons. Love did not descend upon them like lightning. It accumulated like trust. One evening, while Lady Agatha slept and the house had gone still, Sebastian found Elinor in the small library table's circle of candlelight mending a tear in the sleeve cuff of a maid's Sunday pelisse. You employ a duchess strangely, he said. The duchess employs herself. Sit down if you are going to criticize. He did. After a while he said, more softly, you should not have had to earn room in every place you entered before coming here. The needle paused in her hand. No, she said. I should not. He looked at the mended cuff, then at her. I am angry on your behalf more often than is sensible. I had noticed. And you? Are you angry? She thought of Edmund, of rooms where she had become function, of years that had taught her invisibility so thoroughly she wore it like a second shawl. Less than I was, she answered. There is not enough room in me for anger and peace. Peace has lately been the stronger lodger. He reached across the candlelight then, not to claim, only to lay his fingers gently over the hand that held the needle. The contact was brief, changed everything. I do not deserve the tranquility of you, he said. No one deserves another person, Elinor replied, though her voice had gone unsteady. One only learns whether to value what has been given. For the first time since their marriage, it seemed possible that the thing between them was not merely growing warmer. It was becoming dangerous in the old, beautiful sense of the word. The next morning a letter arrived from Edmund Harrow requesting an audience. Sebastian wished to throw it into the fire. Elinor asked that he be received. If he has come to borrow money, I refuse him, Sebastian said. He has not come to borrow. He has come to calculate. I would rather see the sum before he names it. Edmund arrived with the brittle self-possession of a man who had already misread his reception as weakness. He congratulated Elinor on her improved circumstances, remarked upon Ashcombe's scale, praised the trust's visibility, and then, after enough circling, disclosed that certain papers relating to their father's old settlements had been misplaced. There might, he suggested delicately, be correspondence that could embarrass the Duchess if misinterpreted by malicious eyes. He would of course regret such a development. Deeply. Sebastian's expression became so still that even Edmund noticed. You are blackmailing my wife, the Duke said. I am preventing confusion. You are pricing your silence. Edmund spread his hands. The world is unkind, Your Grace. Stories travel. One must protect family. Elinor understood then that Edmund had allied himself with someone cleverer. He had never possessed the finesse to turn old papers into public harm without guidance. Lady Arabella had found the instrument she required. Sebastian ordered Edmund from the house and sent a groom to follow him as far as the inn road. But the visit did its work. The threat was no longer rumor. It had moved into the realm of documents, implications, and social death written in a hand genteel enough to be believed. The fortnight before the founder's ball sharpened everyone. Pritchard became more correct, Mrs. Flint more vigilant, Lady Agatha more lethal, Elinor more calm, Sebastian less able to disguise when he was afraid. He was afraid for her reputation, yes, but more than that, he was afraid of the look that might come into her face if the world once again managed to reduce her to something useful only when hidden. He had seen that look once in the conservatory at Harrow House, after Edmund laughed about Norfolk. He had sworn without words that he would rather break the room than see it returned. Domestic_6. 3 nights before the ball, he found her in the picture gallery before the portrait of his mother. Not avoiding it now, studying it. She was beautiful, Elinor said. She was formidable. Beauty merely distracted people long enough for them to discover the other thing. And which do you think the world saw first in me? He stopped a few feet from her. Candlelight trembled on the gilt frame. The world, your usefulness, because the world is greedy and short-sighted. He paused. I saw restraint first, then intelligence, then courage so practiced it disguised itself as courtesy. Her throat tightened. That is a very costly way of saying I looked severe. He smiled faintly. You did look severe. I found it reassuring. Because you are absurd. Because I have spent my life among people eager to charm me. Severity felt like honesty in a better dress. There, in the quiet between portraits and candle smoke, some last formal barrier gave way. Not in touch, in permission. Elinor stopped wondering whether she was merely tolerated by accident and began to understand that she had become necessary by essence. The night of the Founder's Ball came with clear skies and a hard silver moon over the snow-dim grounds. Ashcombe was bright from cellar to attic. Carriages lined the drive. Musicians tuned in the gallery. Ladies arrived in velvet, satin, gauze, and winter silk, all with necklines cut and sleeves arranged according to fashion yet held within the strict propriety of the season. Elinor descended last. Her gown was not crimson. It was not jeweled emerald. It made no attempt to compete with Lady Arabella's practice spectacle. It was a quietly magnificent shade between twilight blue and softened slate. Its long sleeves fitted, its neckline high and elegant, its skirts falling in clean lines that honored form without displaying it. Pearls touched her throat. Her hair, chestnut threaded with silver, was arranged simply. She looked not younger, not louder, not transformed into somebody else's fantasy. She looked entirely herself, and because of that, astonishing. Sebastian, waiting below, forgot for one dangerous second that other people existed. "If you continue to stare, Your Grace," Lady Agatha murmured from beside him, "the county will assume you are in love." "Let them exercise their intellect," he answered. Elinor heard him. Color touched her cheeks, not with maidenly confusion, but with the slow dawning of being cherished by a man who had ceased to conceal the fact even from himself. The early hours passed in glittering order. The trust subscriptions were announced. Local benefactions applauded. Sebastian opened the dancing with Lady Agatha, then with the widow from the East Cottages whose granddaughter had recently married. Only afterward did he cross the floor to Elinor. That choice, deliberate and public, moved through the room like a breeze through candles. Lady Arabella stood near the musicians in black velvet and jet, beautiful as an omen. Benedict Vale hovered nearby. Edmund Harrow, to Elinor's disgust but not surprise, had obtained an invitation through some county relation and wore the expression of a man hoping to profit from the next quarter hour. The orchestra began a slower set. Sebastian bowed. Elinor placed her hand in his. "If war begins tonight," he said quietly as they took their places, "I regret only that the first move will interrupt my evening with you. What a comfort to no one is preferred even to battle." "You are preferred to everything," he said. The words were low. She almost missed them. Almost. She did not answer because the dance had started and because if she had tried, her voice might have told the room too much. It happened just before midnight, when people are at their most credulous because they are tired and at their most theatrical because they do not wish to admit it. The last set had ended. The musicians were setting aside bows. Footmen circulated with negus and cakes. Conversation had loosened into that final bright disorder peculiar to successful assemblies. Lady Arabella moved toward the center of it with the ease of someone stepping onto a stage she had long reserved. "Before the evening concludes," she said in a voice perfectly pitched to travel, "I believe a matter concerning the trust ought to be clarified for the comfort of several families who depend upon it." Silence did not fall at once. Coagulated. Sebastian turned. Elinor, a few steps from him, felt the room gather its appetite. Arabella held a folded paper. Benedict stood at her shoulder. Edmund Harrow looked pale but stubborn. It was instantly clear that whatever shame remained to him had been leased out for profit. "This document," Arabella continued, "appears to show that prior to her marriage, the Duchess of Westerleigh was party to an agreement concerning trust disbursements and the anticipated sale of certain cottages, in return for private financial security. Mr. Harrow, being family, feared the pain such knowledge might cause and brought it reluctantly to those best placed to verify it." Reluctantly. The word might have drawn blood through lace. A murmur spread. Elinor did not reach for Sebastian. She would not do it. Not because she lacked trust, but because she would not present herself to the room as a woman saved by proximity before truth had spoken. Arabella handed the paper to old Sir Matthew Colling, one of the trustees. He adjusted his spectacles. Benedict murmured something about regrettable necessity. Edmund stared fixedly at the musicians' gallery, as if hoping never again to see a human face. Sir Matthew read. His brows drew together. "There is indeed a signature here resembling her Grace's," he said slowly. "Resembling," Elinor repeated. Her voice was clear. "May I see it?" The paper was passed to her. The room watched with a greed so naked she almost pitied it. The accusation was clever. It claimed that before her marriage she had agreed privately to favor future consolidation of the cottages in exchange for the settlement of Harrow debts, and that she had entered the marriage partly to facilitate the arrangement. The wording was genteel, the implication filthy. It made her mercenary, dishonest, and faithless to the very women whose welfare had justified the marriage's haste. For one heartbeat the cruelty of it pierced her. Not because it was true, because it understood what kind of lie would most efficiently deface her. Then the habit of attention saved her. She looked again. The date referenced the Michaelmas quarter in a phrasing no steward at Ashcombe used. Worse, the disbursement line cited cottage allowances under winter rents to be adjusted at Lady Day. Anyone who had worked real estate books knew the error at once. The cottages under the Benevolence Trust were not recorded that way. They never had been. The formula on the page mixed private tenancy language with charitable allotments, the sort of mistake a clever outsider would make after studying papers without understanding the practice beneath them. Elinor lifted her head. "This is a forgery," she said. A whisper ran outward. Arabella's face did not change. How fortunate that innocence is always so decisive. Not innocence. Familiarity. Elinor stepped forward until candlelight fully caught her. The document uses the term winter rents for properties held under the Benevolence Trust. No such term appears in those ledgers. Their maintenance allowances are entered under St. Martin's distribution notes and audited at Candlemas before Lady Day supplements are calculated. Whoever wrote this copied the shape of estate language and missed the life inside it. Sir Matthew blinked. Another trustee nodded involuntarily. Benedict opened his mouth. Sebastian closed the distance between them before the cousin could produce a word. "That is not all," the Duke said, taking the paper from Elinor and holding it up. "My mother's trust papers were always marked by our old solicitor with a small pressed emblem in the lower wax margin. Not for decoration. To detect exactly this sort of counterfeit. Here there is none. Because whoever composed this knew enough to imitate her phrasing and not enough to understand her precautions." Sir Matthew reached for the document again, examined the seal, and went white with fury. Good God! The room tilted. Not toward Arabella's accusation now, but away from it. Edmund made the mistake of speaking. "I only wished to sell your sister twice," Sebastian said, his voice as cold as the snow outside. "Once when you offered her future like spare furniture, and once tonight when you found a higher bidder for slander." Arabella drew herself up. "This is intolerable. I brought concern in good faith." "No," Elinor said. The single word carried farther than she expected. She looked at Lady Arabella and, for the first time, saw the whole woman rather than merely the rival. Not a monster. A widow who had built survival upon visibility. A woman terrified of aging into irrelevance, of losing influence, of discovering that admiration purchased no safety. Wounded pride had calcified into cruelty. Fear had dressed itself in satin and called itself entitlement. "You brought injury in elegant wrapping," Elinor said quietly. "You wanted me diminished because my presence reminded you that rank cannot force affection and performance cannot compel being chosen. I am sorry for what need has made of you. I am not obliged to excuse it." Arabella's face flared. Anger, shame, disbelief. That was the instant Sebastian stepped fully to Elinor's side. And then he spoke. "You would like to know," Sebastian said to the room, "why I chose my wife. Since society has spent months inventing answers, I will save it further labor." No one moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Command, when honest, has no reason to shout. "I did not choose her for youth," he said. "I did not choose her for dowry. I did not choose her because she dazzled a ballroom, flattered my vanity, or fit some childish sketch of what a duchess ought to resemble at a distance. I did not choose her for convenience, though she brought order to every chaos she touched. I did not choose her because society approved, because society did not even bother to see her." His gaze went to Elinor, and in that gaze the room learned the difference between public speech and revelation. "I chose her because she notices what others ignore. I chose her because she is brave without making theater of bravery. I chose her because she can walk into a room arranged to belittle her and leave it more dignified than she found it. I chose her because she knows the names behind the accounts, the hunger behind the request, the humiliation behind the silence. I chose her because in a house, in a county, in a life too often ruled by display, she is the rarest thing I have ever known. A woman who makes goodness practical and truth unafraid." The air changed. Elinor felt it on her skin. He went on. and the anaphora gathered force like a tide. I chose her not because she was easy to overlook, but because overlooking her had already proved the poverty of everyone else's sight. I chose her not because she needed saving, but because I was tired of a world that mistakes quiet worth for absence. I chose her not because she asked to be exalted, but because she had spent too many years being used by people too small to deserve her. I chose her because she was seen, by me, from the first moment. And because once I had seen her, I found I could not willingly return to any room, any table, any future in which she was not at the center of it. No violin moved, no glass chimed, even the fire seemed to wait. If any person in this county wishes to question my judgment, he said, his tone turning glacially polite, he may do so after first proving himself half as honorable as the woman he maligns. As for forged documents, blackmail, and conspiracies against the trust, my solicitor will be delighted to continue this evening in a less decorative setting. Sir Matthew, recovering his righteous fury, called at once for the paper to be secured and for Benedict and Edmund to remain available for questioning. Benedict attempted outrage and produced panic. Edmund attempted family feeling and produced nausea. Lady Arabella tried one last fragment of hauteur. Failed her. She looked suddenly not grand but exhausted. A woman who had wagered the remains of her dignity and lost. The room, relieved to have identified its moral weather, turned upon her with the indecent speed crowds reserved for fallen idols. Sebastian did not watch them. He watched Elinor. She had expected vindication to feel like triumph. Felt instead like release. Years of invisibility did not vanish in a speech, however beautiful. But something knotted deep inside her loosened when he had said, before all of them, that the failure had belonged not to her but to those who had refused to see. Lady Agatha arrived at her side like seasoned artillery. "My dear," she murmured, "if you faint now, do ensure it happens artistically. We have earned at least that much from the evening." Elinor laughed through the dangerous brightness in her eyes. "I believe I would rather stand." "Excellent. It is infinitely more inconvenient to your enemies." The music resumed eventually because society, even when morally corrected, prefers accompaniment. But the evening's story had already been written, not by gossip, by declaration. Later, when the last of the trustees had withdrawn, when Benedict had been sent away under watch and Edmund under disgrace, when Lady Arabella had requested her carriage with a hand that trembled only once, Sebastian found Elinor in the conservatory adjoining the ballroom. It had been dressed for winter with evergreen garlands and forced blossoms. Among them, near the far glass, stood a white rose tree in deliberate bloom. "You planted treachery and found horticulture instead," Lady Agatha had said to Arabella on her departure. Elinor almost smiled at the memory. Sebastian came to stand before her. No witnesses now. No crowd. Only lamplight, glass, and the faint scent of roses surviving out of season. "I should have said those things sooner," he said. "Perhaps. But you said them where they were needed. They were needed by me long before they were needed by the room." She looked up at him, and there was no corridor left between them. Not formal distance. Not doubt disguised as courtesy. Only the last honest edge. "Did you mean all of it?" she asked. His answer was immediate and unguarded. "Every word. And several I omitted because the county did not deserve them." The absurdity, tenderness, and gravity of that answer together undid her. She smiled. Then, because happiness had become more frightening than sorrow, she said the truest thing she could manage. "I did not know a woman could be chosen for being exactly herself." His hand rose, slow enough for refusal, and touched her cheek. "Then everyone before me was blind." When he kissed her, it was not with the hunger of conquest. It was with the wonder of arrival. Gentle at first, then certain, then deepening because neither of them stepped away. The white roses, the glass, the music muffled beyond the door, the long path from contract to tenderness. All of it seemed to gather there, in one quiet, irrevocable moment. Afterward, he rested his forehead briefly against hers. "Come back to the ballroom with me," he said. "I owe my Duchess a dance in a room that has finally learned her name." She went. They danced once, late and almost alone, beneath chandeliers burning low. It was the private, intimate beat concealed inside a public victory. His hand at her back, her trust beneath it, both of them moving without hurry because there was no distance left to overcome that night. Spring came to Ashcombe without apology. The snow withdrew from the fields in ragged surrender. Water ran quick in the ditches. Lambs appeared in the lower meadow like unfinished thoughts made suddenly visible. Windows opened. Fires grew smaller. The house, once grand and guarded, learned the softer noise of ordinary gladness. The scandal concluded as such scandals usually do when stripped of elegance. Benedict's correspondence exposed a scheme to pressure trustees into profitable consolidation. Edmund, frightened by the first serious letter from Sebastian's solicitors, confessed enough to disgrace himself thoroughly and protect no one. Lady Arabella withdrew to Bath under the pretense of caring for an elderly relation. Society called it nerves. Lady Agatha called it exile with better upholstery. The trust remained under Sebastian's and Elinor's joint direction. At Elinor's urging, the cottage allowances were restructured to include winter cloth and emergency fuel without formal petitions. The old nursery suite became a sewing and reading room for village girls 3 afternoons each week. Mrs. Flint pretended not to approve and approved extravagantly. Pritchard discovered that smaller dinners produced better conversation. The round table stayed in the library. No one missed the old geography of silence. As for Elinor and Sebastian, they ceased to astonish themselves by degrees and began, instead, to delight each other more practically. He brought her estate maps with margins marked for her opinions. She left him notes beneath his papers reminding him to eat and sleep in roughly equal measure. He listened when she disagreed. She contradicted him without fear. Sometimes they rode out at dusk and returned with muddy hems and wind-burned cheeks. Sometimes they spent whole evenings with a book open between them and conversation wandering wherever the firelight led it. In May the first true bloom opened in the forcing house. A white rose, late and perfect, its petals held like a small luminous answer. Sebastian found Elinor there at sunset, her gloved fingers just beneath the flower as though protecting it from admiration. "Late snow has decided to forgive us winter," he said. She smiled. "I think it merely wished to make its entrance memorable." He stood beside her. Through the glass the gardens glowed green and gold. Beyond them the cottages smoked peacefully in the mild air. "When I first saw you beside a rose," he said, "I thought I was choosing a duchess. And what do you think now? That I was being taught the difference between rescue and grace." She turned fully toward him. There were still moments when happiness felt almost too large for the shape old sorrow had left behind. But it no longer felt impossible. He took her hand and placed in it a small ivory label newly painted by the gardener. On it were 2 words, "Late snow." Beneath them, in finer script, "Westerleigh White." She looked up in startled laughter. "You named it?" "No, the household did." Mrs. Flint said one cannot keep calling a thing neglected when her grace has plainly proved otherwise. Tears rose to her eyes before she could prevent them. She had spent years being useful in rooms that erased her. Here, somehow, even the garden remembered. Sebastian touched the label, then her hand. "You were seen," he said quietly, "even when you thought you were invisible. I only had the privilege of saying it aloud first." At last Elinor understood that love had not come to make her younger, louder, or less herself. It had come to witness her truly, and in being truly seen she had become, at last, at peace. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. She sometimes wondered whether houses themselves could relearn people. Ashcombe had first known her as an arrival so sudden that even the clocks seemed startled. Then it knew her as the Duchess with the neat hand, the measured voice, the inconvenient gift for noticing every deficit. By late winter it knew her by sound, the lighter step in the south passage, the pause outside the still room before entering, the soft turning of pages in the library after dinner. Sebastian knew her by sound too. He could distinguish her tread from any maid's, her way of setting down a teacup from Agatha's briskness, her silence from every other silence in the house. To be recognized in one's smallest habits is a form of intimacy no declaration can imitate. There are marriages built on thunder and others built on weather. Thunder persuades witnesses. Weather changes landscapes. The days at Ashcombe were weather. Repeated, ordinary, impossible to dramatize and therefore impossible to counterfeit. A chair drawn closer to the fire before she entered. A message sent to the kitchens that her Grace preferred broth when tired and ought not to be contradicted. A ledger left open because he wanted her eye on one suspicious figure. A walk delayed until she had finished with a tenant's petition because he had learned that postponing affection for duty would only teach duty to become endless. Such things did not glitter. They endured. Elinor, who had once believed that only dazzling love could count as love at all, began to understand the holiness of the quieter kind. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her. She learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an impostor borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. When villagers curtsied to her in spring, Elinor no longer felt like an imposter borrowing rank she had not earned. She felt accountable in the best sense, tethered to something larger than her own old injuries. Sebastian had given her a title in one night. Ashcombe had given her belonging by degrees. The distinction mattered. Titles can be bestowed. Belonging must be practiced until it stops feeling like performance. She had practiced so long at being invisible that visibility itself had once seemed another costume. Beside Sebastian, beneath Lady Agatha's amused protection, among servants and tenants who tested and trusted her, she learned at last that being seen did not require becoming a spectacle. It required meeting another gaze without apology and discovering oneself still whole inside it. And somewhere, perhaps, another storm-dark estate was waiting for the night a disguised marquis would offer one forgotten governess a bargain that changed both their lives. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.